The haunted lighthouse, the wrecker's beacon. The ship tore itself apart on the jagged rocks below the cliffs. I stood frozen in the doorway of the lighthouse, watching helplessly as the waves smashed against the hull, sending fragments of timber and cargo scattering into the dark waters. The moon hung low, shrouded by heavy clouds, casting an eerie half-light over the scene. The light from the beacon spun relentlessly, slicing through the mist like a blade. But instead of guiding the ship to safety, it had lured it straight to destruction. I clutched the cold iron railing, my knuckles white. This wasn't the first ship to meet its fate along this cursed stretch of shore, nor would it be the last. I knew the stories well, how the lighthouse, built over 2 centuries ago, had been a tool for wreckers who thrived on the bounty of misfortune. They had tied lanterns to the necks of donkeys and walked them along the cliffs, tricking ships into thinking safe harbor lay ahead. The spoils of the wrecks became their livelihood, and the bodies of the drowned were left for the sea to claim. But the curse? The curse began when the wreckers turned on each other. The wind howled around the lighthouse as I stepped back inside, slamming the heavy wooden door behind me. My footsteps echoed through the stone stairwell as I descended, the beam of the lantern in my hand flickering against the damp walls. Below me, the lightkeeper's quarters felt colder than ever, the air thick with a dampness that clung to my skin. I paused at the foot of the stairs, my heart pounding. There was no escaping the guilt that hung around me like a chain. I'd inherited this lighthouse from my father, as he had from his father before him. And with it, I had inherited the curse. I hadn't wanted this life. Alone on the cliffs, the endless sound of waves and wind and silence. But the past doesn't let go so easily, especially not here. I had tried to stop the light once, dismantling the mechanism and plunging the beacon into darkness. It hadn't mattered. The light had returned the next night, shining brighter than before, as if mocking my efforts. The next morning, they found the wreckage of a fishing boat scattered along the rocks, the bodies of its crew bloated and lifeless in the tide pools. And now, as the screams of the dying echoed faintly over the roar of the sea, I felt the weight of my failure pressing down on me. The lighthouse would claim its victims, whether I willed it or not. That was when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from above, the shadow on the stairs. I froze at the base of the spiral staircase, the sound of footsteps faint but deliberate. Someone or something was moving above me, just beyond the beam of the lantern's light. My first instinct was to call out, but the words caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be here. The lighthouse was mine, and no one dared approach without my knowledge. Not at this hour. The footsteps paused, and the silence that followed was worse. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to listen, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But where could I go? Outside was nothing but darkness and the treacherous cliffs. And deep down, I already knew. I couldn't escape this place, not really. The lighthouse wouldn't let me. Slowly, I began to climb the staircase, the iron railing cold and slick beneath my trembling hand. The lantern swayed with my movement, casting shifting shadows along the curved stone walls. Each step creaked louder than the last, like the sound of bones grinding underfoot. I cursed myself for not replacing the warped wood long ago. But then again, who would I have been fixing it for? The higher I climbed, the colder the air became. The sound of the waves faded, replaced by an unnatural stillness that clung to the tower like frost. The light from the beacon above strobed through the narrow windows, each flash illuminating the stairs in bursts of harsh white. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night itself, lingered just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. It wasn't cast by the railing or the walls. It didn't belong to anything I could see. It moved as I moved, retreating up the stairs when I advanced, always just out of reach. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs faltered beneath me. But the compulsion to follow was stronger than my fear, as if the shadow was pulling me upward like a marionette on strings. When I reached the landing just below the beacon room, the shadow disappeared entirely. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a noose. I gripped the doorknob to the beacon room, my fingers numb from the cold. The door felt heavier than it should, as though the lighthouse itself resisted my intrusion. When I finally pushed it open, the light from the beacon spun in relentless circles, bathing the room in harsh flashes of blinding brilliance. But the room wasn't empty. A figure stood by the massive Fresnel lens, their back to me. They were cloaked in black, their form blending with the shadows. For a moment, I thought it might be one of the drowned, one of the countless victims of the cursed light, come to drag me to the depths with them. But then they turned their head, just slightly, and I caught a glimpse of their face. It wasn't waterlogged or bloated. It wasn't even human. The face that stared back at me was carved like the figurehead of an ancient ship, its wooden features twisted in a grotesque mockery of life. Its hollow eyes burned with a faint, spectral light, and its lips curved into a jagged grin. "You can't save them," it rasped, its voice like wind rushing through broken sails. "You never could." The lantern slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor and plunging the room into darkness. Only the lighthouse beam remained, spinning in its unholy rhythm. By the time my eyes adjusted, the figure was gone. But the voice lingered, whispering from the shadows, "You're part of it now. You always have been." The wrecker's laughter. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in ragged gasps as the room spun around me. The shattered lantern's faint smell of oil hung in the air, mixing with the cold, salty tang that seemed to permeate the lighthouse. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a weight that pressed against my chest, making each breath a struggle. The whisper had said, "You're part of it now." What did that mean? My father's voice echoed in my head, his words from years ago when he'd first handed me the lighthouse keys. "The lightkeeper's duty is sacred. This isn't just a job. It's a legacy." At the time, I dismissed it as old-fashioned bluster. But standing there, the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't a legacy, it was a curse, and I was its prisoner. A sudden crash below jolted me from my thoughts. It sounded like a door slamming, the echo rippling up the spiral staircase like the toll of a bell. Someone was inside, or something. The laughter came next. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't far either. It started as a faint chuckle, the kind of sound you might hear from someone sharing a private joke. But it grew louder, fuller, until it filled the lighthouse. It was everywhere, coming from the walls, the stairs, the beacon itself. A chorus of voices joined in, their tones sharp and jeering, mocking, cruel. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound seemed to slip inside my skull, bypassing every defense. They were wreckers, I realized, the voices of those who had once prowled these cliffs, leading ships to their doom. And now they were here, laughing at me, the newest pawn in their endless game. "You think you can stop it?" One voice hissed, its words a sharp whisper that cut through the cacophony. "You can't. The lighthouse wants this, feeds on it." The words struck something deep in me, something primal. I bolted for the stairs, my boots hammering against the iron steps as I fled downward. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away from that terrible, inescapable laughter. But the lighthouse had other plans. As I reached the landing near the storage room, the door to the outside slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing me in. The laughter grew louder, turning into a roar that drowned out the pounding of my heart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence. It was so sudden, so complete, that for a moment I thought I had gone deaf. The only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. The stillness pressed down on me like a weight, and I could feel the lighthouse watching, waiting. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking. The words echoed down the spiral staircase, swallowed by the void below. A single sound broke the silence, the slow, deliberate creak of a door opening somewhere deep within the lighthouse. It wasn't the outside door. It was coming from below, the basement, the place my father had forbidden me to go. "The answers are waiting," the voice from the beacon room whispered in my mind, unbidden. "If you have the courage to face them." I didn't feel brave. I felt like a man being led to the gallows. But my feet were already moving, drawn downward by some invisible force. The staircase spiraled into darkness, and with every step, the temperature dropped, the air growing heavier. the shadows deeper. At the bottom of the stairs was the basement door, slightly ajar, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The creak of its hinges echoed like a scream. I reached out with trembling hands and pushed it open, stepping into the darkness. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp earth, salt water, and something sour, like decay. The second was the sound. Faint whispers, too soft to make out but growing louder as I moved forward. They weren't mocking this time. They sounded pleading. And then I saw it. In the middle of the room stood an ancient stone pedestal, its surface worn smooth by time. On top of it sat a brass lantern, tarnished and covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe under the flickering light of its flame. The whispers came from the lantern itself, swirling around me like a wind. But as I reached out, the flame inside the lantern flared, illuminating the walls. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The walls were covered in names. Hundreds, no thousands of names, carved into the stone with desperate, trembling hands. Some were fresh, the letters sharp and clean. Others were so old they were barely visible, worn away by time and dampness. And there, at the bottom of the nearest wall, was a name I recognized. My father's, the keeper's names. I stared at the wall, my knees nearly buckling as my father's name glared back at me from the damp stone. The letters were carved with precision, each stroke deep and deliberate. My lantern flickered, casting the other names into shifting shadows. They seemed to move, like the wall itself was alive and breathing. I couldn't tear my eyes away. There were so many names, stretching high and wide, far beyond what the feeble light could reveal. Some were faint, reduced to little more than scars on the rock, while others were as sharp as if they'd been carved yesterday. My father's name wasn't alone. Just below it, another name glinted in the dim light mine. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. That wasn't possible. I hadn't carved it. I hadn't even known about this place until now. And yet, there it was. My name etched deep into the stone, as though the lighthouse had already claimed me. The whispers intensified, their indistinct murmurs brushing against my ears like cold fingers. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The voices weren't coming from the room. They were coming from within me. "Why is my name here?" I demanded, my voice echoing through the chamber. "What do you want from me?" The lantern on the pedestal flared in response, its light spilling across the walls and illuminating more names. But this time, something was different. The letters began to shift, rearranging themselves as though the wall was alive. The names twisted into a message, carved anew before my very eyes. The beacon must never die. I staggered back, my heart pounding like a drum. The words pulsed with an unnatural glow, each letter alive with malice. The whispers began to form words now, a chorus of voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. "Keep the light," they hissed. "The ships must come. The rocks must feed." "No!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I backed away. "I won't do this. I won't be a part of this." But the voices only laughed, their sound rattling the very air around me. The lantern flared brighter, its golden flame flickering as if taunting me. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into the shapes of figures. Wreckers, sailors, the drowned, all watching me with hollow, accusing eyes. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my boots slipping on the damp stone. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. They called my name, each syllable dripping with venom. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, slowing my ascent. When I finally reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and leaned against it, gasping for air. The lighthouse was silent once more, save for the rhythmic creak of the beacon spinning above. But the silence offered no comfort. The lighthouse felt more alive now, its presence wrapping around me like a shroud. I wasn't just trapped within its walls, I was part of it. I glanced up the spiral staircase toward the beacon room, its light casting sharp, spinning shadows down the stairwell. The words from the wall echoed in my mind. The beacon must never die. My hands trembled as I gripped the railing. If I left the light burning, more ships would come to their doom. If I extinguished it, I didn't know what would happen. But the lighthouse wouldn't let that go unpunished. I was caught in its grip, just like my father, just like every keeper before him. The only question now was how long I could hold on before it claimed me entirely. The lighthouse awakens. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every creak of the lighthouse, every gust of wind against the tower, felt like a threat. I sat in the keeper's quarters, staring at the small window as the light from the beacon swept across the waves, its rhythm relentless. Each pass seemed to pull me closer, like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I tried distracting myself, flipping through the logbooks left by the keepers before me. Most were mundane entries, weather reports, notes about passing ships, but every so often, there was something darker. One entry, dated nearly a century ago, caught my eye. March 3rd. Another wreck tonight. The crew was screaming for help, but the rocks claimed them before I could even get to the shore. The light burns too bright. It wants them. I flipped the page, my fingers trembling. March 5th. Tried to douse the light again, but it came back stronger. The flame feeds on something I can't see. I hear them at night now, whispering. I think they're in the walls. The ink on the next line was smeared, as though the writer's hand had faltered. The final sentence was barely legible. The lighthouse doesn't need a keeper. It needs a prisoner. A chill ran through me, and I slammed the book shut. The words on the page mirrored my own fears, my own reality. The lighthouse wasn't just cursed. It was alive, and it was growing stronger. The floor beneath me groaned suddenly, the sound reverberating up through the walls like a living thing. The lantern on the table flickered, its flame dimming, before a low, guttural hum filled the room. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a deep resonance that vibrated in my bones. I staggered to my feet as the walls seemed to ripple, the very stone shifting as though the lighthouse was breathing. The hum deepened, a mournful wail echoing through the tower. I clutched the edge of the table, my pulse racing. Then, the door to the keeper's quarters slammed open. The wind howled through the room, whipping papers into the air and extinguishing the lantern entirely. I turned toward the doorway, but instead of the familiar spiral staircase, I saw something else. A corridor of jagged rocks, slick with seawater, stretching into darkness. The sound of crashing waves filled the air, and the faint glow of the beacon pulsed at the far end, casting long shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. This wasn't the lighthouse anymore. It was something else, something it had been hiding beneath its surface. I stepped forward, the floor wet and uneven beneath my boots. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, the walls closing in around me as I moved deeper. My breaths came in shallow gasps, each step dragging me closer to the pulsing light. And then I heard them, the voices. Turn back, one whispered, its tone desperate. Leave while you can. No, another hissed, colder, sharper. You belong here now. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms indistinct and shifting. They were sailors, their faces pale and waterlogged, their eyes empty sockets that stared straight through me. One by one, they turned to face the light, their bodies drawn forward like moths to a flame. You can't stop it, one of them rasped, his voice a hollow echo. The lighthouse takes what it needs. The hum grew louder, the walls closing in tighter as I reached the end of the corridor. The beacon loomed before me now, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. And there, standing in its glow, was the figure from before, the one with the wooden face and hollow eyes. You're part of it now, it said, its voice blending with the hum. The light must feed. You know what to do. My hands shook as I reached for the lever that controlled the light. Part of me wanted to extinguish it, to plunge the tower into darkness and break the cycle. But the other part, the part the lighthouse had already claimed, knew that wasn't an option. The light wouldn't die. Couldn't. The figure grinned, its jagged mouth twisting into an expression of triumph. The ships are coming, it whispered, and you will guide them home. The next ship. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had come, melting into the glow of the beacon. I stood frozen, the lever trembling in my grip. My instincts screamed to pull it, to extinguish the cursed light and end this nightmare. But the beacon pulsed brighter, its light casting shifting shadows that danced like specters around the room. The tower hummed again, deeper this time, almost a growl, as if warning me not to defy it. Slowly, the hum grew louder, shaking the very walls of the lighthouse. And then I heard it, the sound that filled me with dread. A ship's horn cutting through the roar of the waves. My blood turned to ice as I rushed to the window, peering into the black abyss of the sea. There it was, a faint light bobbing on the horizon. The ship was drawing closer, its silhouette barely visible against the churning water. I could see it now, the flicker of its lanterns, the dark outline of its masts. And worst of all, the path it was on, a path that led directly to the jagged rocks below. "No," I whispered, my breath fogging the cold glass. "Not again." The whispers began to fill the room, echoing in my head like a swarm of gnats. "The ship must come," they said. "The rocks must feed." I stumbled backward, covering my ears in a futile attempt to block them out. But the voices were relentless, growing louder with every passing second. They weren't just in my head, they were in the lighthouse, in the walls, in the air. I turned back to the lever, my heart pounding. Could I stop it? Could I extinguish the light and save them? The figure's voice echoed in my mind. "The light must feed. You know what to do." My hand hovered over the lever, trembling with indecision. But before I could act, the tower shook violently, nearly knocking me off my feet. The beacon flared, its light burning brighter than ever, casting the entire room in harsh, blinding white. The ship's horn blared again, closer now, its desperate cry cutting through the howling wind. I stumbled to the window, squinting against the glare. The ship was bearing down on the rocks, its crew scrambling on deck, their shouts lost in the roar of the storm. I could see their faces now, pale and desperate, their eyes wide with terror. And then, the inevitable. The ship struck the rocks with a deafening crash, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoing across the cliffs. Waves surged around it, slamming into the hull and tearing it apart. The crew clung to the wreckage, their screams carrying on the wind as they were dragged into the merciless sea. I turned away, unable to watch, but their cries haunted me, piercing through the walls and burrowing into my skull. The whispers grew louder, triumphant now, their tone almost gleeful. "The lighthouse feeds," they hissed. "The rocks are satisfied." I fell to my knees, the weight of my failure crushing me. My hands covered my face as I tried to block out the sound, but it was no use. The cries of the drowning mingled with the whispers, forming a cacophony of torment that I couldn't escape. And then silence. The room was still, the hum of the beacon the only sound remaining. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. I peered out the window again, but the sea was empty now. The ship was gone, its wreckage claimed by the waves. The rocks below the lighthouse glistened in the light, slick with seawater and something darker. I turned away, my stomach churning. I had failed. Again. But then, something caught my eye. A shadow at the base of the staircase, barely visible in the flickering light. It moved, shifting like smoke, and then it began to climb. The figure returns. The shadow moved with purpose, gliding up the staircase with an unnatural grace. It wasn't walking, it was flowing, like a liquid darkness defying gravity. My instincts screamed at me to run, to flee down the stairs and into the night, but my feet refused to move. It was as if the lighthouse itself was holding me in place, forcing me to confront whatever was coming. Step by step, the figure ascended, its form solidifying with each passing moment. The shadows coalesced into the same grotesque figure I'd seen before, its wooden face carved with cruel precision, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the beacon. "You see it now," it rasped, its voice blending with the hum of the tower. "You feel it." I backed away, my hand gripping the edge of the beacon's pedestal for support. "Feel what?" I demanded, though my voice cracked with fear. "The pull," it said, stepping closer. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring my terror. "The hunger. The lighthouse is alive, keeper. It always has been. And it needs you, The words hit me like a blow, and I shook my head, trying to deny what I already knew deep down. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't choose this." The figure tilted its head, a cruel grin spreading across its jagged mouth. "But you did. You took the keys. You stepped into the tower. And now you belong to it." I shook my head harder, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "This isn't fair. I didn't know." "It doesn't matter," the figure hissed, its voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You're part of the cycle now. The light will burn, the ships will come, and the rocks will feed. Over and over, until the end." Its words wrapped around me like a noose, tightening with each syllable. The weight of the lighthouse's curse pressed down on me, threatening to crush me. I could feel it now, the pull it spoke of, a dark, insatiable hunger that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It wasn't just the beacon that was alive. The entire tower was a living thing, and I was trapped inside it. "What happens if I leave?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure laughed, a sound like splintering wood. "You won't leave. You can't. The lighthouse won't let you." I wanted to argue, to fight back, but the truth of its words settled in my chest like a stone. I had felt the pull the moment I'd stepped inside this place. The same pull that had kept my father here until the end of his life. There was no escaping it. Not really. The figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes boring into mine. "But you can make it easier," it said, its tone almost gentle. "Give in. Accept your role. Keep the light burning, and the lighthouse will take care of the rest." I stared at it, my mind racing. Could I live with that? Could I resign myself to this cursed existence, watching helplessly as ship after ship met its doom? The thought made my stomach churn, but the alternative, fighting the lighthouse, defying its will, seemed impossible. As if sensing my hesitation, the figure leaned in closer. "The light must burn," it said, its voice a whisper now. "You know what happens if it doesn't?" Before I could respond, the figure dissolved into smoke, its form swirling upward and vanishing into the beacon's glow. The hum of the tower grew louder, the light pulsing in time with my racing heart. I was alone again, but the weight of the figure's words lingered, heavy and suffocating. I turned to the lever, my hand trembling as I gripped it. "The light must burn," it had said, but at what cost? I stared into the beacon's blinding glow, my mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. The voices from below whispered in my ears, their tone pleading now, desperate. "Turn it off," they said. "End it." But the hum of the tower seemed to drown them out, its rhythm steady and unrelenting. The lighthouse had made its will clear, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to fight it. The price of defiance. I didn't know how long I stood there, hand gripping the lever, my mind waging a silent war. The hum of the beacon filled the room, pulsating like a living thing. The air felt charged, alive with the weight of countless decisions made before me. Keepers who had stood in the same spot faced the same impossible choice. I had to know. I had to understand what had brought this curse upon the lighthouse, upon me. And if there was a way to break it, I would find it. Resolving to uncover the truth, I descended the spiral staircase, each step accompanied by the eerie groan of the tower. The walls felt closer than before, the shadows deeper, as if the lighthouse was tightening its grip around me. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't yet make out their words. At the base of the stairs, the air was cold, almost icy. I hesitated before the door to the basement, the memory of the names on the wall still fresh in my mind. But something deeper called to me now, a need to uncover the root of this darkness. The door creaked open, revealing the damp, stone-lined room. The pedestal was still there, the tarnished brass lantern resting atop it, its flame flickering weakly. The walls loomed with their cursed inscriptions, but this time, the light from the lantern illuminated something new, a set of stairs. They were carved into the far wall, partially obscured by shadows, descending into an even deeper darkness. The air around them was heavier, thicker, as though the space beyond them was pressing outward, desperate to escape. I hesitated, but the pull was stronger now. I descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers became clearer, overlapping voices blending into an anguished chorus. They spoke of betrayal, of greed, of the wreckers who had used the lighthouse to lure ships to their doom. But there was something else, a name repeated over and over like a chant. Elias Harker. The name sent a chill down my spine. My grandfather. He had been the keeper of the lighthouse long before my father, a man whose name had been spoken in hushed tones even among our family. My father had never spoken of him in detail, only that Elias had died under mysterious circumstances. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. A room carved from the bedrock itself, its walls slick with moisture. In the center stood an altar of black stone, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize. And on the altar lay a book, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages filled with writing that pulsed faintly, as though alive. I approached cautiously, my fingers brushing the cover. The whispers grew louder, the voices frantic now. "Don't read it," they screamed. "You'll doom yourself." But another voice, calm and commanding, spoke above the chaos. "You want answers, don't you? Open it." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the book. Then, with a deep breath, I flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, but one passage stood out, written in bold, jagged script. "The beacon burns with the souls of the drowned. Their torment is its fuel, their suffering its light. The keeper is the tether, the chain that binds the lighthouse to this world. To extinguish the light is to sever the chain, but the cost is steep. The keeper must pay the price." The words blurred as my vision swam, my mind reeling. The whispers screamed louder, a cacophony of anguish and rage. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. The cost was steep. What did that mean? My life? My soul? The figure's voice echoed in my mind. "The lighthouse doesn't need a keeper. It needs a prisoner." A wave of despair washed over me as the full weight of the curse settled on my shoulders. I could end this, I could extinguish the light and break the cycle. But the price, was I willing to pay it? The room began to shake, the altar trembling as the lantern's flame flared brightly. The voices crescendoed into a deafening roar, and I staggered backward, my head spinning. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the beacon above. I stood there, alone in the darkness. The book's final words burned into my mind. "The keeper must pay the price. The lighthouse demands its due." I ascended the stairs from the altar room, the weight of the book's revelation pressing down on me like an anchor. The whispers had grown quieter, but they hadn't vanished. They lingered just on the edge of hearing, murmuring accusations, pleas, and curses. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the lighthouse itself was fighting me, trying to drag me back down into the depths. When I reached the main level, the air felt different, thicker, charged with a strange energy. The tower's hum was louder now, reverberating through the walls and rattling the glass panes. The light from the beacon spun faster, its beam cutting through the night like a blade. But this wasn't the calm, steady rhythm I'd grown used to. It was frantic, erratic, as though the lighthouse was panicking. And then I saw it, the next ship. Its lights bobbed on the horizon, growing brighter with each pass of the beacon. The storm had returned, clouds swirling like a vortex above the sea, and the waves crashed violently against the cliffs. The ship's horn blared, a desperate cry for help that pierced the air. It was coming too fast, too close, drawn in by the cursed light. I rushed to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I gripped the frame. The ship was larger than the last, a cargo vessel with towering stacks and crew scrambling on its deck. Their shouts carried faintly on the wind, their terror palpable. My stomach twisted as I realized there was nothing I could do. The rocks would claim them just as they had claimed so many before. Unless I stopped the light. The memory of the book's words burned in my mind. The keeper must pay the price. Was I willing to give up everything to break this cycle? My life, my soul, whatever it was the lighthouse demanded. My hands trembled as I turned toward the staircase, my gaze locking onto the lever that controlled the beacon. The whispers returned, louder now, each one a different voice urging me in conflicting directions. Pull it. End this madness. Don't. The cost is too great. You can't fight it. The lighthouse will never let you go. I stumbled forward, my heart pounding as the ship drew closer. The screams of the crew mingled with the whispers, creating a deafening cacophony that filled my head. The air in the room felt electric, the hum of the beacon growing so loud that it vibrated in my chest. The figure was there again, waiting beside the lever, its wooden face twisted into a cruel grin, its hollow eyes burning with malice. You think you can stop it? It hissed, its voice a low rasp. You think you can break the chain? I didn't respond, my focus locked on the lever. My fingers curled around it, my knuckles white as I fought the instinct to pull it immediately. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against my skin. You'll only make it worse, it said. The lighthouse is eternal. If you destroy the light, it will take you, and the rocks will still feed. I hesitated, doubt creeping into my mind. What if it was right? What if extinguishing the light didn't stop the curse but unleashed something even worse? My grip on the lever faltered, and the figure laughed, its voice echoing through the chamber like splintering wood. You're already part of it, it said. The light is in you now. Pull the lever and you'll take its place. I looked back out the window, my heart shattering as the ship's horn blared one final time. It was almost upon the rocks, its fate sealed unless I acted. I turned to the figure, my voice trembling. If I don't stop it, they'll die. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. They'll die either way. The lighthouse will make sure of that. I clenched my teeth, my resolve hardening. Maybe it was right. Maybe the curse couldn't be broken. But I couldn't stand by and let another shipwreck unfold without trying. With a scream of defiance, I pulled the lever. The beacon's light flickered once, twice, before plunging the tower into darkness. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The figure let out an inhuman howl, its form twisting and writhing as it dissolved into smoke. The walls of the lighthouse groaned, the entire tower shaking as though it was collapsing under the weight of its own curse. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the whispers reached a fever pitch. The darkness around me pulsed, alive with rage and desperation. The lighthouse was fighting back, its very essence clawing at me, trying to drag me down into the depths. And then, I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder, its grip unyielding. The final light. The hand on my shoulder was ice cold, its grip like iron. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, pressing in from every side. Slowly, I turned my head, dreading what I would see. It was my father. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his expression etched with sorrow. His hand remained on my shoulder, though it felt more like a shackle than a gesture of comfort. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if carried on the wind from a place far away. You shouldn't have pulled the lever, he said. His words were calm, but they cut through me like a blade. I whispered, my voice barely audible. I couldn't let them die. His grip tightened, and his eyes burned with a faint, spectral light. The lighthouse doesn't care about their lives. It only cares about its light. And now that you've extinguished it, it will take what it's owed. The tower groaned around us, the walls trembling as cracks began to form in the stone. The air grew colder, the whispers returning in a chaotic, anguished roar. I tried to pull away from my father's grasp, but his hand held me in place, his hollow gaze locking onto mine. You're the keeper now, he said, his voice rising over the din. You've always been the keeper. The light burns in you. I shook my head, my heart pounding. No, there has to be another way. The curse can't go on. His expression softened, just slightly, but his grip didn't waver. There is no end, only the cycle. The lighthouse takes and it gives. You pulled the lever. You've chosen your place. Before I could respond, the room was flooded with a brilliant light. It didn't come from the beacon, it came from me. The glow emanated from my chest, warm and searing all at once, as though my very soul was being pulled apart. The tower's shaking intensified, the cracks in the walls widening as the light spread outward, consuming everything in its path. My father stepped back, his form fading into the glow, his voice echoing one last time. "Keep the light burning." The world around me dissolved into white, the sound of the waves and the whispers fading into a deafening silence. For a moment, there was nothing, no tower, no sea, no storm. Just the light, endless and all-encompassing. And then I opened my eyes. I was standing in the beacon room, the lever back in its place, the light spinning once more in its relentless rhythm. The tower was still, the storm outside reduced to a faint drizzle. It was as though nothing had happened, but I knew better. I turned to the window, my heart sinking as I saw it. Another ship on the horizon, its lights flickering in the distance. The lighthouse's beam cut through the fog, guiding it toward the shore, toward the rocks. I tried to move to stop the light, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My hands wouldn't obey me. The lighthouse had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before. I was no longer just its keeper, I was part of it. The whispers returned, softer now, a lullaby of despair that wrapped around me like a shroud. They weren't angry anymore, they were welcoming. The ship's horn blared in the distance, its fate sealed by the unrelenting pull of the light. I watched, helpless, as the cycle began again, the rocks waiting hungrily below. I was the lighthouse now, and the beacon would never die.